ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
This conversation includes content that may be sensitive for some listeners.
I think everyone knows that the life of a teenage girl is a non-stop cavalcade of joy and unrestrained delight. They never complain, their rooms are pristine, they confront the world and their parents with honesty, directness and good humour. Except when they don't, which is almost never, or in fact perhaps it's all the time. Dannielle Miller is here today. Dannielle knows how to communicate with teenagers, particularly those who are having a rough time of it. Dannielle runs programs for both teenage girls and boys that help them adjust to their rapidly changing selves and the world around them. And it should be said that Dannielle is not some nice, naive, well-intentioned person from a nice, comfortable middle-class background. Dannielle emerged from a childhood that was, at times, frightening and dangerous. She became a teacher and was immediately attracted to the kids that no one else could handle. Today, Dannielle runs education programs at women's shelters, and she's also the CEO of Enlighten Education, a schools program for teenage girls, and one for teenage boys called Goodfellas. Hi, Dannielle.
Hello.
I want to start with your teaching career, the very start of your teaching career. Where was your first post?
It was just around the corner in Blacktown. I am a proud western suburb girl of Sydney, but that was considered to be a bit of a prize. You see, I went to University of Sydney and they had a program at the time targeting outstanding graduates. Really, that was a program designed to get teachers in schools that no one else wanted to teach in. But I hadn't realised that. And because I lived in this area, unlike my peers at Sydney Uni who all went to private schools and lived on the North Shore, I was quite thrilled to be working at this school in Blacktown. And I did absolutely fall in love with it and in love with the students there.
How were you on day one? How were you feeling on day one?
Oh, I was really nervous. I mean, I went to a Catholic girls' school, so I wasn't really used to being around teenage boys, and I was going to be teaching predominantly boys, and I was going to be replacing a teacher who was much older and more experienced, who had had a nervous breakdown, I was told, because the students had been so challenging. And on the
you were told that on day one?
Yes. I got to meet him and he had developed a nervous stutter and he cried when he was doing the handover to me. So I did feel somewhat intimidated, and I was also given by the leadership team a whistle, and I was told that if I felt particularly at risk or threatened in the classroom, I should blow the whistle and someone would come running in to rescue me.
You're given a whistle with this class? It was like that? You needed a whistle for self-protection?
Well, I didn't, as it turns out.
Right.
As it turns out, I loved it, loved those students. And although it was often exhausting, and I certainly did feel burnt out on many occasions, what I realised even before I entered that classroom was that I was going to have to be good. I was going to have to really bring my A game to engage these young people. And I also realised early on that despite my best intentions, they were not going to be interested in Jane Austen if they hadn't felt safe in their homes the night before, or perhaps if they hadn't eaten breakfast that morning. So I really quickly became much more interested in student wellbeing.
But how did you reach out to them? Because there's some kind of control is needed, isn't it? You have to do what? Smother them with your personality? Or what do you do? How do you do that on day one? How do you command their attention?
You command it by being assertive, even if you're faking that assertiveness a little bit to begin with. Teenagers in particular, much like animals, can smell fear. And they also do know when you have genuine good intentions for them. They have amazing radars for bullshit. So if I would walk in authentically passionate about my lesson, they would at least give me 5 minutes to hear me out. And if that first 5 minutes was captivating enough, then I could kind of hold them in my hand. And they realised early on that I was a safe person and that I was someone that cared about them and wanted to know their lives beyond my classroom and beyond my lesson. And their lives were often deeply traumatic and problematic. And really, in hindsight, it was a miracle they turned up at all, right? And a great honour that they would turn up to be in my classroom.
How do you reach out to them at that level? Do you do that just very quietly one-to-one, or can you do that within the environment of everyone else hearing this?
All of the above. So definitely one-on-one conversations. And in those conversations, sometimes it would be revealed that that boy in year 8 who's been acting up constantly and getting kicked out of classrooms is doing that because actually he can't read. And he doesn't want anyone to know that. So he's smart enough to realise if I'm really naughty really soon, I'll get kicked out and no one will notice that I'm illiterate. Or it might be that you decide Maslow's hierarchy, feed them first. So let's have a breakfast club. Let's get you fed before school. And while I'm giving you peanut butter sandwiches and a glass of juice, you're probably going to open up to me about what else is happening in your life that really matters to you. And often it's role modelling. So they would be watching at all times. So I can't tell them that I'm safe and I care if they see me in the playground bellowing at some kid or bullying or bustling my way around. So you have to be a good role model and almost bring your best self as much as possible. And I loved that because it did encourage me to be a much stronger teacher.
Do you need to focus on small infractions as to set up a kind of a sense of boundaries, or is it better to let those small infractions pass by?
Definitely let them pass by. I mean, your teaching, particularly in a school like that, needs to be trauma-informed. So you are picking your battles at all times. You're realising that this young person who perhaps doesn't have their shirt tucked in may have witnessed their dad being dragged off to jail the night before. And it's a miracle that they've turned up, and it's a miracle that they're in a seat. So don't sweat the shirt. You know, don't worry about the superficial small things. Try and focus on bringing them in, not calling them out. And I think that's a good philosophy for life, actually.
Years ago, I interviewed a UK teacher, a celebrated UK teacher, and sometimes he would swear as a way to kind of snap them out of what their expectations of what a teacher was in order to sort of use something that was vulgar and intense and real and in their face, and that kind of got them listening. Do you do that?
No. No, I don't. I really feel... Because I was only 22 and I was also teaching students who were 18, 19, I think one of my students was actually 21 because he'd gone back to school to do his HSC. It was really important that I came across as professional as well for them. And that gave them a sense of that she seems to know what she's doing and she's in control of this. But I definitely was warm and I would use humour. I think the biggest compliment when you've got a classroom full of year 9 boys who you know can be quite challenging is when they accidentally call you mum. So they might sort of put their hand up and say, Mum, and they're, oh, I mean, miss. And you think, oh, that's actually really sweet because subconsciously you've now put me in this really maternal place in your mind and in your heart. And I was always very careful of protecting them, but at the same time protecting myself.
You have extensive burn scars on one of your arms. Did you try to hide that from the kids to avoid the distraction of it, or were you open about that?
I think I was smart enough when I started teaching to realise that I had to be a good role model for the young people that I was teaching. So I couldn't say to them, love yourselves the way you are, if I was forever hiding in jumpers. They would have sniffed out again that inauthenticity. So I guess I was proud of my scars and I owned them in front of my students, and then they realised that wasn't a vulnerability. So they couldn't target me for that. So they might have said things to me about, not liking the book that I had set or finding a particular test that we did a chore, but no student ever at that very tough school mentioned my scars. Yeah, they were very, very affectionate and very kind.
What can you tell me about how you got those burn scars?
Well, I was 3 years old and I went with my beautiful, beloved grandmother to visit her mother in Tasmania. My grandparents used to mind me when my parents worked when I was small. So my grandma took me along to visit her mother, who she'd had quite a fractured relationship with. And my great-grandmother poured hot cooking all on me.
I have to ask, who does that to a kid? Was this mental illness? Do you know, or do you even think about that?
I don't think about it, which might sound strange. I often get asked, why did she do that? I mean, what reason could there be? The truth of it is that I think lots of people experience violence when they're children from adults, and there is no rhyme or reason to that. And for me personally, I don't know that it would have been very helpful or healing to even try and get a sense of why that might have happened. But I do know that my grandmother, who was there with me when she ran into the room and saw me on the ground, believed that it had been done on purpose. And I do remember seeing my beautiful grandmother's shocked face, and I do remember thinking, I think I could be in trouble here because she looked so devastated. And I did nearly die. I've got very serious burns, particularly when you're little. You know, the shock of that injury, the pain of it is often what will kill you. And I was in hospital, I believe, for about 4 or 5 months. I had to have 4 separate surgeries and skin grafts. I got golden staph, I got German measles. I'm sure it was a very tough time. Being so small, I don't remember a lot of the trauma, but I do actually have vivid memories of that time.
Of being in hospital, you mean?
Yeah, very vivid memories. But fortunately, they are of being loved and cared for, and they are very internal. As strange as it sounds, I would remember laying there just in my little undies because I couldn't have a nightie on or a sheet on my bed, and I'd be isolated from everyone else. And I would say to myself in this really soothing voice, "You'll be all right. You'll be okay." Now, I'm sure it was probably the voice of a nurse perhaps or a parent that had said this to me at some point, but it was like my own little mantra that I would use to calm myself down, and I still use it.
That little mantra, you'll be all right, you'll be okay.
Yeah.
It's not I'll be all right, I'll be okay. It's you'll be all right, you'll be okay. Whose voice is that? Is that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. As I said, perhaps originally it was a nurse that would say that to me and stroke me to calm me down, or perhaps it was a parent, but it did certainly become my own inner mantra. And it's funny because I've never noticed that it is you, not I, and I do still speak to myself with that, "You'll be okay, you'll be all right." I guess
you almost sang it too. It's like a little kid would.
Correct. It's very soothing to me when it's said that way. Yeah.
And do you still use it today?
I do. It came back to me full force when I had my daughter actually during labour, and I'd almost forgotten it was laying there in my subconscious. But when I experienced that deep pain, all of a sudden this mantra emerged, and it's been with me ever since. It was a beautiful gift.
Where is that voice? Is it like somewhere above you or somewhere? It's an interesting thought, isn't it? It just occurred to me. Where is that voice, do you think?
It surrounds me. I don't know whether I am wired for resilience and self-soothing and self-preservation, but I certainly have it in spades, or whether indeed being burned was formative. So sometimes I think, did that time all alone, just in my undies, so badly hurt, did that make me stronger? Because if I hadn't been, I would have died. But equally, my relatives say to me, "But you were always a little feisty thing." Yeah, but I've always been really interested in developing strategies for myself that can keep me safe and that can get me through tough times.
Will that work for other people, do you think? That you'll be all right, you'll be okay?
I think it might, because I do mention part of that story when I work with teenage girls. And often they'll contact me afterwards to talk about a particularly difficult time they had in their life. And they'll say that they adopted that same mantra and they could hear me in that voice telling them that, which I think is so beautiful.
What was life like when you came home from hospital as a little girl?
I think it was probably fine at first, because when you're little, you can be quite naive to what's happening within the home. But certainly the first time I saw my dad be violent with my mum, I would have been about 5 or 6. And from that point onwards, I knew that home wasn't always a safe place and that there could be explosions of aggression and that there was manipulation, there was dysfunction, there was a lack of boundaries. Being at home could be distressing. You're walking on eggshells when you live in a home where there's family violence because you don't know what could happen next.
And were you brought into those violent incidents as well?
Yeah, I was certainly was aware of them. You would certainly hear them. You see, when parents say things like, "Oh, well, we don't fight in front of the children, we wait till they go to bed." I mean, their rooms are not soundproof, right? You hear. And in fact, sometimes being behind closed doors and hearing bangs and hearing screams and hearing screeches can almost be worse because you don't know what's happening beside the other side of that door. There's no predictability to how people are acting around you, how the adults are acting. One minute you feel safe with them and you feel close to them, and the next minute there's drama and there's tension and there's boundaries being broken and there's manipulation. And I was fortunate, or unfortunate depending on your perspective, I suppose, in that at least I could see that it wasn't right and it didn't sit right in my tummy. And I knew that this wasn't how it should be. I remember vividly, I would go into my bedroom sometimes and I would get out my little tape deck and I would record my own voice. And on that tape deck, I would say things like, this is what happened tonight at home. And it did happen. And no matter what anyone tells you, you know what you know. And you're not to allow that to happen. You're not to listen to them when they tell you those things. I was trying to maintain my sense of sanity in what felt like a really chaotic environment. I was building up my own inner defiance. In some ways, I think about that and think it's a really peculiar thing for a little child to do, but actually it's incredibly protective.
Yeah, it's an act of journalism to begin with.
Right.
So there was pressure just to ignore it, just to go, oh, this isn't really happening,
and we're not going to talk
about
this.
There
always is.
And you got on the cassette recorder and went, this is definitely happening.
Yes, and this is how it made me feel, and this is what this person said, because they're going to deny that later. I did also use my tape deck for good, because I would also record stories for my sister to listen to. And just recently, actually last month, she emailed me to say that she recalls she would go to bed listening to the sound of me reading her stories. I would play her those so she could hear those at night. Maybe I wanted to drown out the sound of other things that were happening in the home.
How were other kids about your situation and about your burns? Were you tormented? Because kids are cruel. They can be cruel. They can be very kind, but were they cruel as well to you?
No child was as cruel to me about my burns as I was, right? I remember not caring about them much at all until I was 10 and discovered boys for the first time, Richard. And I had my first crush on a bad, bad boy. And he made a comment about my scar and said that it looked like I had spiderwebs all over my body. And I remember being completely gutted by that and going home and thinking I would never be loved and believing that I would have to cover up those scars because they were hideous. And by the time I got to high school, I knew enough to just wear my school jumper all the time and cover up. But no one else really got a chance to say much about them because I was so good at hiding them, I suppose.
At 10, you moved from Tasmania to Sydney to live with your grandparents for a while. How different was life with your grandparents?
It was blissful. I adored my grandparents, particularly my grandfather, actually. And I think they thought it would be really challenging for my sister and I to live there. I think we were there for about 6 months before we as a family moved into a home. But even though I would have to sleep on a little mattress on the floor in his bedroom with him because my grandparents had separate bedrooms, which I think was quite common with older people back then, I loved it. I thought it was heaven. He was such a beautiful, gentle, kind man. Yeah.
They take you out for treats?
They did. And I remember Richard being very disappointed because I grew up in Tasmania. Back then there was no McDonald's. McDonald's had been built up in my mind as this fantasy land of giant burgers. And they took me to Parramatta McDonald's and I had a Big Mac and I cried and they thought it was because I was so excited, but I told them it was because I thought the burger was rather small. It wasn't really a huge burger at all. So that was a major blow and I guess a strong experience in understanding that you can't always believe the hype that you see about things, to be a critical thinker.
You're clearly a bright, smart, energetic kid. Did you like being a smart kid?
Oh, I loved it. I escaped into books as well. I loved reading. I loved the praise from my teachers. And they were often books with female heroines like Trixie Belden or Nancy Drew, who would outsmart the adults around them. And I also really loved, and isn't this very telling, I really loved looking at books depicting dolls' houses, little perfect homes, and I loved Barbies and Playing House. So I think in hindsight, I really loved the idea of creating and crafting a perfect little home where everyone felt safe and seen.
You said your first crush was on a bad boy.
Yes.
Did you try your hand at being a bad girl, quote unquote, for a bit?
Yes, I definitely did. By the time I was about 14, I was running pretty wild, binge drinking, hitchhiking, hanging out with bad boys and motorbikes, all kinds of behaviours that I can look back now and think, wow, that was really quite self-destructive.
Where would you go binge drinking at 14?
Oh, Richard, you just go to the local park. I mean, you'd go to the blue light disco that was run by the police. I mean, I feel like we all binge drinked quite a lot, certainly in the suburb I grew up in.
You got hammered at a blue light disco?
Oh, I think everyone did. It was a strange time. I mean, I think the TV series Puberty Blues depicted that really well. There didn't seem to be a lot of adult supervision, even when there was meant to be adult supervision. And there was a lot of wild and reckless behaviour. And I think a lot of that was me testing the boundaries of what it would mean to be an adult, perhaps playing with power. I think some of it could have been self-destructive, actually. I always find it interesting today when adults say things like, when I was young, we'd go out into the streets and we wouldn't come home till dark. And they say this wistfully like it was a safer and better time, but it wasn't always.
No, it was not.
Some of the things we were doing were not safe. And it's a wonder any of us came out of that time unscathed. But thankfully, by the time I was 16, I developed my first crush on a good boy. And
on a good boy?
Yes, he was one of the prefects at the boys' school next door, and he was lovely. So I had a beautiful experience of first love where he would bring me flowers to school every day. He didn't buy them, he stole them from gardens, but it felt romantic. And he would write me love letters, and it was lovely and pure, yeah.
Did you try and conceal your scar from him?
I did at first, but I realised that wasn't really going to fly. And he certainly made me feel as if I was beautiful and lovable with or without my scars.
Did he say that to you?
Oh, yeah, all the time. He would always tell me that I was beautiful and that they were irrelevant. But when we broke up after 18 months, that negative self-talk returned. And actually, he told me at the time that, we were breaking up because we were so serious and we were so young and he was going to be going to university and it all felt too intense, which is perfectly valid. But in my mind, it was because he met a prettier girl. And I still had this mindset, this compare and despair mindset that often as young women we have.
What do you mean compare and despair?
Where we're looking around us. So I think our culture grooms girls to play compare and despair. You think about it when you're a young girl, particularly for me growing up, it's who's in, who's out, who wore it best, who's hot, who's not, ranking, rating, Miss Universe, pageants. You do feel that your value as a woman is very much, as an emerging woman, is very much determined by your looks, that's your currency. And that if someone prettier comes along, well, that must be the reason that they are liked beyond you.
In all honesty, is that something really that males impose on females or something that women come up with in their own group? Because the arcane details of what's pretty, men are often quite not cognizant of that at all.
A little of column A and a little column B, I would argue. I mean, certainly the idea that a woman's worth is based on her looks has been around since the beginning of time, right? And for me, unpacking a lot of those beliefs didn't come through the magic words of a boy telling me I was beautiful. It actually came from when I went to university and I studied gender and I discovered feminism. And for me, that was the light bulb moment. That was discovering that the people that often write these rules that would hold us down are men, and it's not an individual man, it's a system. So I remember reading a book by Naomi Wolf at the time called The Beauty Myth, and in that there was a line where she said, we don't need to change our bodies, we need to change the rules. I thought, oh, yes. And who is writing these rules about women's bodies? Who is trying to control us? What could we change in the world if we weren't so busy trying to change ourselves?
What's it like when you tell teenage girls about your own memories of being a teenager and those feelings of devastation, insecurity and comparing and despairing, as you say? What's it like when you tell teenage girls today about how you were back then?
Oh, they love it. So there's this myth that, teenagers don't really want to hear about when we were young. Well, they don't if it's going to be a lecture where we tell them that we tramped to school in the snow in our bare feet. But if it's going to be an honest sharing of our vulnerabilities, they're so there for that. And when I tell my story with humour and with vulnerability, you can hear a pin drop in the room. they're very fond of me at the end of that exchange. And that is why I begin my work by sharing my story, because it is through stories that we connect. And we connect not just the mind, but the heart. And I often say, once you capture their heart, then the mind follows. And so by taking that time to be vulnerable for them and share with them, they realise that we're more alike than we are different. And there's much beauty in that.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Feidler. You can find more conversations on the ABC Listen app or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
So we were talking before about that devastating heartbreak that you went through, the awful crisis of compare and despair that you went through, as you said. Did you run off the rails again for a while after that?
Yeah, I really did. I think as a culture, we're so dismissive of teen relationships. We think of them as mere puppy love and unimportant. But the truth is they are formative. It is your first experience of love.
Oh, they're totally devastating.
Oh, and so when you have been dumped, as I felt I had been, you have no experience that this will pass and you will love again. And although people say to you, don't be silly, you're going to have lots of boyfriends. And in fact, I have had. I didn't know that then. And I really did think that he would be the only one who would love me for all that I am and look beyond my scars. And I spent at least a year just heavily drinking and feeling so desperately sad. Unfortunately, it was also my HSC year, which is not great timing to have these things happen. And isn't that a cruel twist of fate that often, just as young people are forming these beautiful bonds with each other and exploring love and relationship for the first time, they're also doing the most important bloody exams of their life. So we have to have a lot of compassion and I think dig a little more deeply into what's happening in adolescent relationships to give them meaningful strategies to deal with those things.
Nearly every teenager at that point is going through some kind of devastating relationship. They have the end of school exams and acne often as well.
And people are telling you, what would you like to do for the rest of your life? And you don't even know what you want for lunch. It's very cruel.
And what's worse is when grown-ups say, oh, these are the best years of your life. Being a teenager, you're young and free. It's not how it feels at the time.
And I still have the occasional bad dream about sitting a HSC exam and not feeling prepared for it. I don't think I've ever felt as stressed as I did back then with all of that swirling in my mind.
So you got the marks anyway to study
Yes.
teaching at Sydney Uni.
Yes.
Which a lot of rich kids go to Sydney Uni.
Yes, they do.
And did back then when you went there. How did you fit in there in that environment, that Blacktown girl from a rough home?
Well, I think there was one other person in my entire grade at the time who also lived in Blacktown, and all of my peers did go to private schools. And they thought I was a bit of an enigma. They would often say things to me like, do you get scared living where you are? And I think they pictured that I lived in the middle of some sort of gang crime area. I mean, I lived in Kings Langley, which was the posh end of Blacktown, Richard. And I had a lovely home. I mean, on the surface, everything looked very beautiful and shiny. And I remember when they would, come to visit me at my home, they would be really shocked that there wasn't sort of,
Well, they're walking around going,
burnt out cars.
Right.
They did. They really and truly did. They thought it was a very very surreal experience.
How have you gone through life going to a state school without a water view in your home? Hey, how on earth did you do it? Was it like that, or were people rude, or were they more patronising? Like, you've done well, haven't you, to make it here to Sydney Uni?
I think they were more just puzzled.
Right.
Yeah, I think they found me unusual.
So you get the teaching job at the so-called tough school in Blacktown.
Yes.
You get the whistle to blow if the kid's starting to terrify you and you feel yourself to be in physical danger. And you met your future husband around about the same time.
I did.
How were these kids like that you'd actually befriended when they saw you with him out and about?
Well, I remember once going to the local shopping centre and there was this gang of likely-looking lads sort of lurking about, and he very chivalrously sort of stood in front of me and he said, get behind me, babe. And as we walked past, you could hear this, miss. And of course, it was my Year 9 English class, wasn't it? And they all came running over and they were so sweet and they, shook his hand and said hello. And then, of course, Monday they wanted to grill me about who was he, what were his intentions. When I told them that we'd got engaged, they wanted to know whether I wanted a TV or a car. They said they could get me whatever gift I wanted. And I told them there would be none of that. But they were very sweet. And he was very impressed.
Were they joking or were they pulling your leg?
No, they weren't. I don't think they were joking, no.
Miss, we got your cards. Right up there.
No, look, they were very entrepreneurial.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, right. Young men who knew how to go out and get what they wanted, were they?
Absolutely,
Right.
they did. And still be back in time for six period English with Danny, yes.
You got promoted to head teacher for vulnerable students.
Yeah, students at risk coordinator.
Students at risk coordinator.
Students from all sorts of schools come to school with more than just their books and their lunch in their backpack. And with Enlighten, I get to work in schools that have harbourside views and are very exclusive, and I get to work in really tough schools. I work in regional schools. I work with homeless kids. I work with kids in juvenile justice. Lots of them have stories, and it isn't always obvious. So when you go in and you work with a group of young people, there is always this assumption to me that they will be carrying their own lived experience and that they may have their own trauma. And that you need to be sensitive to that, and the work you do with them needs to be trauma-informed. And I think we don't often realise how much young people are attempted to deal with, and often they only have childlike strategies to fall back on. So giving them the skills and the scripts and the narratives they need to know how to make sense of an increasingly chaotic world is such important work. It's my life work.
Did you feel a bit panicked and overwhelmed hearing so many stories and so many different stories? I think that's the first thought a lot of people would have if they were in that situation. Did you feel a bit overwhelmed, did you, or did you not?
Yeah, I remember early on I did, and there was one particularly heartbreaking story of sexual assault. A Year 7 girl shared with me, and I went to the staff room and I cried and I cried. And a beautiful, very experienced leader at the school came in, and she kindly told me that I needed to really just pull my shit together, and that what these students needed from me was not my tears. They needed me to be stable and calm and to work with them. And something about the way she delivered that message really resonated, and it has given me this beautiful capacity when I hear a disclosure to not step into that trauma, but to move alongside it and to think about, what does this young person need me to be? What kind of adult do they need me to be at the moment?
I think, I think we all have a well of compassion, most of us do, but it's always finite. Is it compassion you draw on, or is it a desire to fix things?
For me, I think it's a desire to fix things. I'm very much someone who sees an issue and then thinks someone should do something about that, and probably that someone should be me. And that's been a constant thread throughout my life. And it's a way in which I probably process the things that surround me that feel really unfair or feel really frightening, is to think, well, what are we going to do about it next? Let's get to work. I've always been a worker. I got my first job at 14. I've always had at least 2 jobs, sometimes 3 or 4. And so I always think I just go in to roll up your sleeve and get some stuff done.
When that girl came to you with that story of sexual abuse, are you legally obliged to report that?
Yes.
Even if they've asked you to keep it a secret?
Yes, absolutely. So as a teacher, you're a mandatory reporter. And that means that you do have an obligation to report that. And I would always let students know that. So they would knock on my office door, and they would often start by saying something like, Miss, I need to tell you something, and I want you to promise you won't tell anyone. And my response to them would always be, sweetheart, you can tell me anything and I will listen to you with my whole heart. But you have to know that if you have been hurt or could be hurt, I care about you too much not to do something about that.
And do they want to hear you say that?
Yeah, they do. Even if they don't realise at the time that's what they want to hear, but they would never walk away. What they really want is an adult to take this difficult decision away from them. They don't know what to do with the information that they're carrying, so they want you to make the decision about what needs to be done for them.
It's an act of faith, isn't it?
It is an act of faith. And I've got to be honest, I do think a lot of our systems are broken for kids that come from broken homes and kids who are experiencing violence. And I would sometimes be worried that they might be looking for a solution that we as a society aren't yet really able to provide for them. So if we need to remove children from homes, for example, we don't have a lot of great places to take them. And that's just the truth. I wouldn't tell that to the young person at the time, of course. But the truth is that there's a huge shortage of foster parents who are willing to take on adolescents in particular, that group homes, and I work in a lot of them, they're not always the safest and best place for young people. And I think collectively we need to do more to understand what so many young people are experiencing, because we do know that they are a group that are very vulnerable, particularly if they end up homeless or couch surfing.
It's part of the problem is that generally, socially, our society, we don't really like teenagers very much, do we? We don't like adolescents. They're shouty, they're slovenly, difficult, moody, sometimes violent, sometimes bloody-minded. They feel vaguely menacing to older people when they congregate in public, often quite harmlessly.
Yes.
And they're human beings, and they deserve more. Do you think there's a problem there, a general society-wide problem? We just treat teenagers really badly because older people don't like them very much.
Oh, 100%, particularly teen girls. Actually, we're very judgmental about them. If you think about some of the terminology, that we use when we describe teen girls, it's things like princess bitch face or mean girl or diva. Even when they're happy and they're engaging with each other and they're making up their little slang terms, just as we all did, we like to mock that or belittle that. I mean, look at the way we tend to dismiss the passion of teen girls when it comes to things like fandoms. We mock teen girls because they're obsessed with Taylor Swift, and we sort of roll our eyes at the girls who were upset they couldn't get concert tickets. When we talk about them in this way, they hear those conversations. I think it's really disrespectful. I love teenagers. My idea of heaven was standing at that Taylor Swift concert, holding my beautiful daughter's hand, she's 25, being surrounded by, roaring teen girls who are unapologetically just reveling in teen girl energy. And it was absolutely, I remember thinking, if I die now, I hope this is what heaven looks and feels like.
Stadiums full of girls celebrating love and friendship.
I know, and boys get to have that same sort of passion and that cheering and that camaraderie when they go to sporting events. But yet when we see girls do this at concerts, whether it's teasing them about their love for One Direction or whether it's about a fandom that they're obsessed with, we can be so scornful about it. It's so unfortunate because there's so much joy to be had in that.
Years ago, I interviewed the late, great Celia Lashley, who was a brilliant...
I'm familiar with her work.
She did great work with teenage boys in particular. And I think her secret superpower was she could be with a bunch of teenage boys, speak their language, and let them know she knew who they were, she saw them in all their unloveliness and loved them anyway. 100%. Is that the secret with girls too?
Of course, with all teenagers and with all of us. We want to be safe and we want to be seen. I will admit that sometimes teenagers can be difficult to love, but that is probably when they need our love the most, or at least our tolerance. That doesn't mean that we should forgive bad behaviour, because I do think that as parents of adolescents, we have a responsibility to set some boundaries, to set some standards so that they don't grow up thinking in their adult relationships that you can take out your frustrations on those you love. So I think your role as a parent of an adolescent is to very much set some boundaries around that, but at the same time, to be open-hearted and open-minded.
When you came up with the idea of a schools program for girls, what exactly were you pitching?
I had a secret agenda. My secret agenda was to go to schools and love them. But that would sound very strange if I called a school and said, I'd love to come to your school and love your students. But I did know that that was a piece of the education puzzle that we were missing. I started Enlighten 22 years ago. So there's a lot of wellbeing programs that run in schools now, but there wasn't 22 years ago. And there certainly wasn't for girls, because girls were performing academically, they didn't tend to act up as much, they tend to implode rather than explode. So for a lot of schools, they didn't realise the girls really needed extra support. But of course I knew they did. Girls do suffer from eating disorders, from self-harm, from anxiety, from playing that compare and despair game, from running into the arms of bad boys rather than making great relationship decisions. And it was those conversations that really excited me, but framed in a way that would be very, very loving and create a sense of belonging amongst the girls.
You were part of opening a women's shelter in northwest Sydney. How did that start for you?
Well, I was sitting at my computer at the time. I was writing a newspaper column and I was about to write about yet another woman who had lost her life at the hands of a man who once professed to love her. I get teary thinking about all the women that we lose as a result. We don't lose, they are murdered as a result of domestic violence. And I sat there at my desk that day filled with rage and despair. And as fate would have it, I also read in my local paper that very day that there was going to be a community forum with the hope that we might open a shelter in my local area for women and kids fleeing violence. And I knew I had to go along to that meeting, and I did. And I saw Annabelle Dannielle, the CEO of Women's Community Shelters, stand up and talk about the need in the area. And I saw the beautiful, at the time, head police officer in the area, Rob Critchlow, talk about the statistics in the area around DV and the fact that he would go to these homes and he had nowhere safe to take the women afterwards. And I put my hand up that night and said, I would love to be part of the board that opened this shelter, but equally I'd like to make it my mission to eventually shut it down. And what I meant by that is that I knew from the beginning I wanted to embed education, particularly for young people. And so one of my contributions as a board member was starting a program which we called Walk the Talk, where we would go to local high schools and talk to teenagers about the issues of respectful relationships and consent and give them all that incredible education that I know I'm so good at delivering with my team. And then we would ask them to adopt their local shelter and to do service for it for the year.
Teenagers?
Yes. And so they don't go to the shelter because obviously the location need to be kept secret, but they do the most incredible acts of service. So they might grow veggies that go to the shelter for the women to eat. The boys at Oak Hill College near my local shelter built the most beautiful wooden dollhouse and made all furniture for it for the kids in the shelter to play with. The students raise money. They volunteer at key events. So if you think this matters to you, what are you going to do about it? How can you make a difference? And you start small in your school, in your community, and that can create this beautiful ripple effect. And now I think the program's been running for 6 years. We have 35 schools involved. We've got about 4,000 teenagers. And it's just breathtakingly beautiful, particularly for the boys. Because if you are a young boy and you have grown up in a home with a violent dad, you have often felt very powerless. And a lot of men I speak to still carry completely unnecessary shame and sadness that they didn't do more to help their mum or to stop things. But yet these boys get a chance to stand up with their mates and do something really powerful that can make a difference. I know we had boys at another boys' school make these little welcome packs for the women. And the boys decided on their own initiative that they would handwrite little notes to put in the welcome pack. And the note said, and I still remember it, "We're glad you're safe and we've got your back." And you can imagine as a woman who's had to flee a home where there's violence and there's anger, and you turn up at a shelter and you finally take a breath and you get given this pack and you see this gift beautifully prepared for you from teenage boys in the local area. You know, it fills you with a sense of possibility as well. You know, I've been a cycle breaker in my family. I've chosen to raise my children differently to the way I was raised. And I want to break this cycle of domestic violence, starting with one kid, one school, one community at a time. It electrifies me, the possibilities that it has. If you've spent a whole year with your mates working on a project like this and it's really filled you with a sense of pride, it would be so difficult, surely, for you to then turn around in a few years' time and become abusive yourself, because that is not your cultural norm anymore. Within your cultural norm, within your peer group, the cool thing is to care about this issue. The cool thing is to step up and be an active ally, not just pay token lip service to this issue.
Dannielle, another issue that you've taken on in recent years, which I find quite fascinating, is the issue of school toilets.
I have, the toilet queen.
What's the horror story that got you started on this?
Oh, look, I've certainly seen some pretty ordinary school toilets in my day, can I tell you? But that actually wasn't it. Again, I mean, I should stop reading the news. But again, I was reading a news article and I get too moved to action. But I was reading a news article about a young boy in America, actually, who had gone to the toilets at his school and had taken his own life. Often when students feel incredible distress, they do go to the school toilets to take a breath and to sort of compose themselves. And equally, we know that most school toilets are filthy and revolting, and there's no kids helpline number there. There's no resources, and yet it's a captive audience. Why don't we think more carefully about the way those toilets are kept and in that environment as perhaps a safe place?
So do you want to beautify school toilets? And have you been beautifying school toilets?
I haven't personally, although I do get really funny requests from schools asking me to give them a quote on fixing the plumbing at their school. It's not me waving in with the magic wand. It's me being Glinda the Good Witch and saying, you, my darling, have had the power all along. So what I want to do is say to schools, have a think about your school toilets. If I visited your school toilet and you would say to me, oh, but don't use those toilets because they're really gross, they're the kids' toilets, go and use those staff ones over there, is that really fair? If you think your toilets are gross, fix them, okay? Because the truth of it is we know a lot of young people avoid using the school toilets because they think they're so disgusting. Combine that with the fact this is the most hydrated generation ever. They're all lugging around those 2-litre Stanley water bottles. And the truth of it is that they are suffering physical health implications, you know, things like incontinence as a result of that. Some of them are even refusing to go to school because they're so fearful about going to the toilets. It's really been about encouraging schools, have a good look at your toilets, fix them up. While you're fixing them up, perhaps also put some kids' helpline numbers in there, put some great resources in there, ask the kids to get involved in what kind of slogans lift them up. So they're also reflecting on their own well-being and the impact that environment and space can have on their mood. And it's been incredible. We've got school toilets that have now transformed from Russia to China. In fact, Richard, I had a professor from Stanford University interview me the other day asking for my insights on school toilets. So not bad for a little teacher from Blacktown.
Not bad at all. So much of the focus of your work has been about teenage girls. It's really a very powerful thing for you, this kind of natural affection for them. You observe them closely. You seem to remember your own adolescence so well. It's sometimes said that teenage girls today are really quite distinctly different from teenage girls, say, 20, 30 years ago. Do you think that's true?
I don't really. I think some of the issues they're trying to navigate are increasingly complex. I mean, I may have grown up getting images of beauty from magazines that surrounded me, but I didn't have social media and the 24/7 onslaught of that. And I may have had images that were photoshopped that deceived me, but I wasn't up against things like AI. So in some ways, I think the world they're trying to navigate is more complex. But in many ways, I think being a teen girl is so often about that in-between. You're no longer a girl, you're not yet a woman. So it's this really interesting stage and this really interesting dynamic. And I think that has always been the case. And what I think is exciting about that, for any mothers, aunties, female teachers listening, is that we are not irrelevant. Our experiences are not irrelevant. We can share how we made it through this time. We can share what got us through. They are really open to hearing that kind of message, and they're really open to getting our support.
When you had a chat with my producer, Alice, afterwards Alice came back and said, I felt like I had this sudden, direct encounter with my teenage self from talking with you. She suddenly remembered and felt like it was to feel like she was when she was a teenager. What does that do for you when you do that every day with girls, being in the world of the adolescent mind for so much and for so long?
I love it. I can't think of a better thing to do. I think it keeps me youthful. I just think when I look at teen girls, I don't see the silences, the slammed doors, the eye rolling. I just find them so joyous and so hilarious. And I love the deep affection they show for each other. You know, sometimes when I'm presenting to teen girls, they'll be sitting there and they'll be plaiting each other's hair and sort of stroking each other. And they're like little monkeys grooming each other almost. And we forget the beauty of that. Instead, we really elevate, you know, stories about bullying and stories about when the wheels fall off. But we mustn't lose sight of the joy and the hope and the connection and the possibility that comes with being a teenager.
It's been fascinating speaking with you, Dannielle. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Dannielle Miller is the CEO of Enlighten Education and Goodfellas, and she's also Director of Education at Women's Community Shelters. And if this conversation has raised any issues for you, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 and also 1-800-RESPECT. Today's conversation was produced by Alice Moldovan. Executive producer was Carmel Rooney. It's produced on the lands of the Gadigal, Turrbal and Jagera peoples. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.